I would say that probably most people are familiar with the biblical prohibitions against drinking. You have passages like Ephesians chapter 5, verse 18 and 19, do not get drunk with wine, for that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit. Don't get drunk with wine. It's something to avoid. And you got a lot of statements in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is loaded with warnings against use of alcohol. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 1 says that wine is a mocker, strong drink a brawler, and whoever is intoxicated by it is not wise. And not just there, but you jump ahead to chapter 23. Chapter 23, he says in verse 29, who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has contentions? Who has complaining? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? Those who linger long over wine, those who go to taste mixed wine, do not look upon the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, and when it goes down smoothly. And at the last it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper. Your eyes will see strange things, and your mind will utter perverse things. And you will be like one who lies down in the middle of the sea, or like one who lies down on top of a mast. They struck me, but I did not become ill. They beat me, but I did not know it. When shall I awake? I will seek another drink. Every time I think about that passage, and particularly the last few verses that we read from the end of Proverbs 23, when we lived in Louisville, of course, Kentucky is the home of mankind's three most basic needs: tobacco, bourbon, and racehorses, and particularly the bourbon part. People there drink a lot of bourbon, and of course, so much of that is tied in with the Kentucky Derby. And I remember one year around Derby time in the local newspaper, there was a gentleman in that area who was considered, I guess, an expert on all things bourbon. And he wrote this article about how you evaluate bourbons. And I'll tell you what, I immediately thought of Proverbs 23, verse 29. This guy had looked at, drunk, tasted, and thought a whole lot about bourbon. I mean, this guy talked on and on and on about all the different subtleties and nuances of bourbon. And I thought immediately of this passage. He had spent a lot of time thinking about this. And obviously he knew his stuff, I'll say that. Now, when you read prohibitions like this, you would be correct in saying that the gist of biblical teaching is you don't drink. It's just something that's dangerous. It'll get you in trouble. There are severe consequences to it. But every now and then, someone will say, yeah, Cloyce, but now wait a minute. They'll say, preacher, aren't there verses that say that it's okay to drink? And my short answer is no. But they're thinking about, there's probably a couple of passages in particular, and I want us to talk about this tonight. The one that was just read for us a moment ago is one of two Old Testament passages that I think lend a little bit of confusion to the subject. I'm going to talk tonight about these two passages that some people think give a little bit of, or at least raise the question about whether drinking at some times is legitimate. I want to talk about what I call Lemuel's liquor loophole. And I got a question mark there because it deserves to be there. So we're going to start here in Proverbs chapter 31. We're also going to look at a text from the book of Deuteronomy as well. And then we'll talk at the end of the lesson about just some of the general biblical teachings about the use of liquor. Proverbs chapter 31 is the last chapter in the book of Proverbs. And there are two basic subjects in the chapter. When you look at Proverbs 31, it starts out we're telling us who these words were for and from, the source of this bit of wisdom. The words of King Lemuel, the oracle which his mother taught him. I have no idea who Lemuel was. I don't think there's any way to prove who he was historically. Some assume this is another name for Solomon. The problem is we have absolutely no evidence of that whatsoever. I think Lemuel is one of several people that we encounter in the book of Proverbs who was just a wise man. Maybe he was an Israelite, maybe he wasn't. It indicates here that he was a king of some sort, and he may have just been one of these Middle Easterner kings who happened to be a wise man. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if, given the kind of life that Solomon lived, I suspect he knew a lot of kings. I suspect he ran in some pretty big circles. And I would think probably this is perhaps one of his contemporaries who was considered to be a wise man. And he says at the beginning of the chapter, these are words which his mother taught him. This is good motherly advice. I think it's interesting that when the book of Proverbs starts, the theme that you keep running into, particularly in the first 9 chapters, is this is fatherly advice to his son. The very last chapter is motherly advice to her son. And the last thing we have in the book of Proverbs also is this wonderful portrait of the wise, worthy woman. So it starts out kind of with a male bias, but it ends with a female bias, you could say. And as you look at these opening verses, the mother is giving her son advice, and as you read the first 9 verses, the emphasis on this is about him, not just as a person, but his particular responsibilities as a king. So whatever else you get out of Proverbs 31 verses 1 through 9, it has to be tempered with that in mind. This is kingly advice. This is not just necessarily advice that you would give to any person, but what particular responsibilities did the king have, particularly toward his people? This is one of many passages in the book of Proverbs that deals with, at some level, the idea of social justice. So kind of keep that in the back of your head as well. Again, it's motherly advice, and it starts out with 2 negative admonitions. If you look in verses 3 through 7, it starts out by telling him to avoid 2 things. Do not give your strength to women, or your ways to that which destroys kings. It is not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to desire strong drink. For they will drink and forget what is decreed, and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. Give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to him whose life is bitter. Let him drink and forget his poverty, and remember his trouble no more. And then verses 8 and 9 shift back to the subject of the rights of the afflicted. But in verses 3 through 7, you have 2 negative admonitions. Every time I read this, I get a little bit amused. She warns the king against what 2 vices? Women and booze. She says, son, they will get you in trouble every time, so listen to your mother. And actually, this is pretty good advice. Again, at one level, it's pretty good advice for any man, but it's particularly good advice for someone who is in the position of being a king. These 2 negative prohibitions, number one, it's a warning against unrestrained sexual gratification. Avoid, she says, women. Now, it doesn't really specify here the kinds of women that he ought to avoid. Do not give your strength to women, but the second line says, or your ways to that which destroys kings. I can't help but think she's warning at least against one kind of woman, the woman who's not very virtuous, the woman who is the harlot, the woman who gives herself to other men. That's pretty consistent all through the book of Proverbs. There are several warnings in the first 9 chapters. If you go back to Proverbs chapter 2, for instance, Proverbs chapter 2, beginning in verse 16, these words are given to deliver you from the strange woman, from the adulteress who flatters with her words, that leaves the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house sinks down to death, and her tracks lead to the dead. None who go to her return again, nor do they reach the paths of life. So you will walk in the way of good men and keep the paths of righteousness. Avoid the path that leads to her door, the writer says, and you stay away from that kind of unworthy, ungodly woman. You got several other places that give similar types of prohibitions. Proverbs chapter 5. He says, starting in verse 15, drink water from your own cistern and fresh water from your own well. Should your springs be dispersed abroad, should your streams of water in the streets. And he's talking here about loyalty to a man's loyalty to his own wife. Again, in chapter 7, or in chapter 6, he mentions it again. Chapter 7, basically the whole chapter, is a warning against a foolish young man to go and pursue the ways of a harlot. So all through the book of Proverbs, and you can go on, there's passage after passage that warns against any man pursuing the ways of a godless woman. But I think there's another dimension here, and that is the fact that this is advice to a king. The law of Moses itself warned against any Israelite king accumulating many things, but 2 things in particular. You don't accumulate horses and you don't accumulate wives. Sounds kind of like an Old West drama, but anyway, in the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14 and 15 says that when they got into the land, they would eventually appoint a king over them. Verse 16, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return to that way. And verse 17, he shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. That's an odd combination of three things. He says, number one, you don't multiply horses. Of course, the reason for that prohibition was he did not want his own people to rely on military strength. He wanted them to rely on him. Second, he did not want him multiplying wives because that was a sign of pagan power. Pagan kings had large harems. They had a lot of wives. That was a symbol of power. And he did not want Israelite kings behaving in that way. And then he says he did not want them multiplying silver and gold. Generally, a king was the person who either had the most power or the most money. And that was a symbol, again, that was a pagan standard of kingly status. He said, I don't want my kings doing that. It's ironic that King Solomon, who in many ways was probably the most successful Israelite king, he had his reign ended more or less in moral disaster because he ignored all three of those things. You turn over to 1 Kings chapter 11. In many ways, Solomon was a great king. In many ways, he was the ideal king. And in many ways, he was everything a king shouldn't be. 1 Kings chapter 11, in the opening verses, we're told that King Solomon loved foreign women along with the daughter of Pharaoh, the Moabite, the Ammonite, the Edomite, the Sidonian, the Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after other gods. And Solomon held fast to these in love. He got in trouble because he ignored, number one, the command of God. And I don't know how contemporary he was with Lemuel, but he ignored Mama Lemuel's good advice too. She understood that those kinds of things will get you into trouble. So that's the first prohibition, is a warning against women. Whether she meant immoral women or simply the idea of accumulating hundreds, thousands of wives, you just don't do that. And then the second prohibition is against alcohol. And starting again from our text, this time in verse 4, it says, it is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine or for rulers to desire strong drink. It's interesting that she uses Mother Lemuel uses two different terms here. First, she just uses wine, which was an everyday, ordinary table drink in ancient times. It would have been considered pretty tame by ancient standards. And she says, kings don't need to drink that, and kings don't need to drink strong drink. And that's a word that means the hard liquor. That's what we'd say today, like the fellow up in Louisville with his bourbon. You just don't mess with either one of them is what she's told him. I think that's interesting that both things were prohibited. We understand the prohibition against strong drink. Strong drink, the phrase strong drink occurs quite a bit in the Old Testament. And almost every time it occurs, in fact, I would say every time it occurs, it is prohibited, it is condemned without any exception. And here, the advice is consistent. You don't drink that. Here's the reason why. It says they will drink and forget what is decreed and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. It will mess with your mind. It will confuse you. Her point is that a king needs to have a clear head. A king, more than anybody in the land, needs to be able to think clearly about what he's doing so as not to pervert justice in the land. This is not just about his personal ethic. That's part of it. But this is about how the king functions in relationship to the whole of society. The king was to set an example for everybody else in the land, and by his chasing women and drinking booze, it would undermine his influence and it would lead him to make terribly bad decisions. But here's the problem. Verse 6 and 7, give strong drink to him who is perishing and wine to him whose life is bitter. Let him drink and forget his poverty and remember his troubles no more. And then the text ends in verse 8 with this, and liberty and justice for all kind of thing. You need to pay attention to the rights of the oppressed. Verse 8 and 9, open your mouth for the mute, For the rights of all the unfortunate, open your mouth, judge righteously, and defend the rights of the afflicted and the needy. Is verses 6 and 7 a commendation for the commoners to drink? And my answer is hardly. For one thing, it's hard to square verse 6 and 7. If that is a commendation, why does she turn around in verse 8 and 9 and just say the reverse? You need to look out for the poor person. You need to look out for the oppressed. You need to look out for the little guys. That seems blatantly contradictory in this context. But also, I think the best way to understand verses 6 and 7, she's contrasting his behavior as king with other people. You don't drink wine. I'll tell you who drinks. This is not a commendation, it's a description. It's not a commandment to her son, it is sarcasm. What she says is the kind of people who drink are the ones who are desperate, the ones whose lives have come pretty much to an end, the one who has nothing to live for, and her point is, son, you don't want to look like that. Son, you don't want to give the appearance of being that kind of person. This is not the only place in the book of Proverbs that uses sarcasm as a kind of tool. Chapter 19, verse 27, cease listening, my son, to discipline, and you will stray from the words of knowledge. Are we to take that seriously? Oh, son, quit listening to wisdom. Everything else in Proverbs says otherwise. Everything else in Proverbs says, no, you listen to the words of wisdom. And so I think what you have here in Proverbs chapter 30 with Lemuel is a bit of sarcastic advice. She's making a caricature of someone who is desperate in life, and she says, your life needs to be the exact opposite of that. And I think that's reinforced here by the grammar. The verb that's used in verse 6 is the Hebrew verb natan. Natan simply means to give something. It's also used back in verse 3, do not give your strength to women. The difference is in verse 6, it's a plural. Every other verb that is applied to the king in this text is a singular verb. And when you look at her advice to her son, she says very specifically several times, do this, don't do that. Those are the singular verbs. In this one, it's a plural verb, which suggests she's making a generalization. And so I think that reinforces the idea that what we have here in Proverbs chapter 31 is not good advice. It is not a commandment. It is not a commendation of drinking. It's sarcasm. She understood that her son would take this in a way to say, okay, she's not commending that he go around giving booze to the desperate, but rather she's condemning it and saying that's not what you want your kingdom to look like. So that would be my answer on this particular passage. And also, as we pointed out earlier, it would be flatly contradictory to a lot of other passages, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the book of Proverbs itself. Well, that's text number 1. I don't think it offers us a loophole at all. What about in Deuteronomy chapter 14? Deuteronomy chapter 14, here's another interesting text. And again, some people have tried to use this as evidence of approval of drinking. It says, you may spend the money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen, or sheep, or wine, or strong drink, or whatever your heart desires. And there you shall eat in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice, you and your household. So is this a license to swill? Is this a license for an Israelite to go and get booze and drink whenever they want to? And the answer again is no. This is an interesting text in a lot of ways. It is the basic text here, starting in verse 22 and going through verse 27, is talking about tithing. This is not just general behavior of an Israelite. This is one very specific command that they were required to obey. The law of Moses had a fair amount of information about tithing. Tithing actually predates the law of Moses. Tithing was something that had gone, you can trace it back to even the early portions of Genesis. And so this particular text is dealing, number one, with the subject of tithing. And it serves as a little bit of a transition because the previous portion of Deuteronomy 14 is dealing with the laws of food. What kinds of food they could eat, what kinds of food they could not eat. And then after this text, it shifts its attention to some of the national celebrations that the Israelites were supposed to observe. So I think this text functions as a little bit of a transition point because it combines those two things. It combines food on the one hand, because many of these offerings involve not just sacrificing, but also sharing in a meal with the priest on celebratory occasions. And then it also combines the obvious connection with that. National feast, times when you were supposed to go to the tabernacle or to the temple and make particular kinds of offerings. So this text is a pivotal text in this larger context. The main point here, though, is about laws relating to tithing. As I said, tithing is a very old thing. I know it goes back as far as the time of Abraham, Genesis chapter 14. If you'll recall, Lot got into trouble because he was in a war zone. There were one group of kings attacked another group of kings, and Lot got caught in the middle, so Abraham went and rescued him. And on his way back, we're told in Genesis 14, verse 17, that after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer, and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom, who went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abraham of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And he gave him a tenth of all. Abraham paid a tithe. Later in the book of Genesis, in chapter 28, there's a reference to Jacob promising to give a tithe to God. He makes a vow to God that I will give basically a tenth of everything I have to the Lord. Moses, what the law of Moses did, it took this practice of tithing and imposed some regulations on it. It regulated it, it expanded it, it explained its purpose, it gave regulations about what should be tithed, and just basically gave the rules about it. So that's one of the things that the law of Moses did. It took this practice that was already in place and gave regulations about it. The tithe itself, we're told, belonged to the Levites. Back in the book of Numbers chapter 18. Numbers chapter 18, verse 21, to the sons of Levi, "Behold, I have given all the tithe in Israel for an inheritance in return for their service which they perform, the service in the tent of meeting." So whenever Israelites would go to the tabernacle or to the temple, they would bring their tithe, and basically that was the income for the Levites in return for the service that they did. Now later in the chapter, if you jump ahead to verse 25, we're told that after the Levites received a tithe, they took 10% of the tithe that was given to them. A tithe of a tithe is what the text says. And then they would give that in turn to the priests. So this is how the priesthood and the Levitical system was financed. It was through the tithes of the Israelites. Verse 25, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, "Moreover, you shall speak to the Levites and say to them, when you take from the sons of Israel the tithe which I have given you from them for your inheritance, then you shall present them an offering from it to the Lord, a tithe of the tithe." And then he says down in verse 28, "You shall also present an offering to the Lord." And at the end of verse 28, "From it you shall give the Lord's offering to Aaron the priest." So it explains the purpose and the destination of the tithe. Now you get back to our text in Deuteronomy chapter 14. There's two kinds of tithes that are spoken here. First of all, there was the annual tithe in verse 22. Deuteronomy 14 verse 22, "You shall surely tithe all the produce from what you sow, which comes out of the field every year." And then also, a little bit later in verse 28, he says, "At the end of every third year, you shall bring out the tithe of all your produce that in that year, and shall deposit it in your town." Two kinds of tithes. The annual tithe went to the priests and the Levites in the wherever the tabernacle or temple was located. And then this triennial tithe, which every 3 years they would take that money and give it to the Levites in their own towns. Remember that the Levites lived throughout the land, and this was a way for providing for the local priests and Levites as well. So that's kind of the background of what this is. What is being described in chapter 14, verses 22 through 27 is a special case. You were supposed to take a tenth of your grain or whatever produce was under the tithe. Verse 22, "You shall surely tithe all the produce from what you sow, which comes out of the field every year." So you're supposed to take a tenth of your crops and take them to the place of the tabernacle. Well, suppose you lived a long way away. Suppose you're one of those poor tribes that lives way off in the north. You're in Yankee territory. And suppose you live up there and let's say you have a very prosperous year. You have a bumper crop. You just have grain on top of grain. How are you going to get that all the way, let's say, to Jerusalem? Well, that could create a logistical problem. There might be all kinds of reasons that a man might be prohibited from doing that. So what do you do in that case? And that's what verses 22 through 27 address. Whatever you get out of this, this is talking about a once-a-year event. Even if this were a commendation of drinking, and it's not, at most you could get out of this that one time a year you could drink something. And I don't think that's particularly what he's talking about. So understand the context. He's talking about something that happened only one time a year, and it did not apply to all Israelites. This is not a blanket commendation to anyone who's an Israelite. It's talking about someone who could not logistically get his tithe from where he lived to the place where the tabernacle was. So understand that that's what this passage is dealing with. What you could do is, verse 23, you would take the tithe and eat it in the presence of the Lord your God at the place where he chooses to establish his name. That would be the tabernacle or the temple. The tithe of your grain, your new wine, your oil, the firstborn of your herd and your flock, so that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. But here's the exception. Verse 24. If the distance is so great for you that you're not able to bring the tithe, since the place where the Lord your God chooses to set his name is too far away from you when the Lord your God blesses you, then you shall exchange it for money and bind the money in your hand and go to the place where the Lord your God chooses. So, you take your tithe and basically you get cash for it. You get the cash value of that crop or whatever component or whatever things your tithe included. You get the cash value of it, and then you take that cash to the temple or the tabernacle, and then here's what you do. You take it to the place where the Lord your God chooses, verse 25, and you may spend the money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen, sheep, wine, or strong drink, or whatever your heart desires, and there you shall eat it in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice, you and your household. Now, you take this, you take it to the place of the altar of God, and you basically spend it on the very things you're going to bring in, and you offer a sacrifice. And part of that sacrifice, when they would do this, involves some kind of a meal. And it's in that context that he says you could do it for whatever your heart desires. You would be assuming that every Israelite desired to cash it in for wine or strong drink, but that's just an assumption. It doesn't actually say that. It gives an allowance once a year to one category of Israelites who could not transport their tithe all the way there. A couple of other things we need to notice about this is, is this permission to booze it up on special occasions? There's no indication of that. Number one, it would contradict everything else the Old Testament said about drinking. The Old Testament consistently condemns that word strong drink. It occurs, shikar is the word that's used here, occurs 23 times in the Old Testament. It is always condemned, and it is always condemned very strongly. So you need to keep that in mind. A second thing you need to keep in mind is that some of the Old Testament sacrifices required the use of strong drink. Not to drink, but to pour out on the altar. I personally think it was like lighter fluid, is what I think. And if you look at two different passages, Exodus chapter 29, verse 40, and there shall be 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with 1/4 of a hin of beaten oil and 1/4 of a hin of wine for a drink offering with one lamb. You would offer the animal and you would pour wine on it. You wouldn't pour water. Why? Because that would extinguish the flames. Why would you pour wine on it? Because it's got alcohol in it. And it would serve as an accelerant. And also in the book of Numbers, you have a similar passage, except this one includes strong drink. Numbers chapter 28, verse 7, then the drink offering with it shall be 1/4 of a hin for each lamb. In the holy place you shall pour out a drink offering of strong drink to the Lord. It's talking about something that was included with the animal that was burned. So it's quite possible here that the strong drink is simply for the usage of the priest. And again, even if they were allowed to drink it, and that, go back to our text in Deuteronomy chapter 14, it does talk about eating something in the presence of the Lord. So even if it made that allowance, you still have to take into account that drunkenness was prohibited. You have to take into account particularly that priests were forbidden from drinking before the Lord. You go back to the book of Leviticus, chapter 10, Remember the story of Nadab and Abihu and their sin? What we typically talk about is their offering unauthorized sacrifice before the Lord. But I want you to notice something else. In Leviticus chapter 10, after their death, after fire had consumed them, in verse 8 and 9 of Leviticus 10, then the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "Do not drink wine or strong drink, neither you nor your sons with you, when you come into the tent of meeting, so that you will not die." Wow, I wonder what he's talking about. I think something that gets overlooked in the shuffle when we're talking about Nadab and Abihu, I think they were drunk. I think that's exactly what this passage is reminding us of. Why would he make this prohibition right after the death of Nadab and Abihu? Of course, they did offer an unauthorized fire before the Lord, but I think it was aggravated by the fact they were drunk. They treated the sacrifice of God as unholy. And so priests were not allowed to do this. So you have to keep all of these factors in mind. Again, even if it was a concession, it is nothing more than a concession. And it's a concession that had very special parameters attached to it. And I still am not convinced that that's exactly what's going on. One other point, I don't normally tell people to go out and read commentaries. Commentaries are a mixed bag of tricks. But when you look at controversial passages like this, that's one of those things I get a kick out of reading them. And what most commentaries do here is that they punt the ball. They basically say, we're not really sure what this is talking about, and they give you all the caveats that I just gave you. They gave you all the stipulations, and most of them acknowledge this is a very difficult text, and most of them will say this is probably not commending drinking. So when you've got stuffy scholars who sit around reading this stuff all day, when they kind of agree on that, that's pretty significant. I think when you look at these two passages in context, the one from the book of Proverbs and the one here from Deuteronomy 14, these are not commendations to go out and drink. They appear to be anything but that. There are so many parameters and conditions attached to that that it seems to very strongly suggest that these were exceptional circumstances and not something that every Israelite was supposed to go and do. I want to end the lesson just by talking about the biblical teachings about alcohol. Remember, these are two very isolated texts in the Old Testament. It does not mean that these are giving all people, all time, any kind of approval for it at all. Again, they are isolated kinds of texts. Remember that they come to us from the Old Testament. There's a lot of things that God permitted in the Old Testament that He does not allow in the New Testament as well. The ethic of the Old Testament and the ethic of the New Testament, as far as specific kinds of prohibitions and allowances, are often very, very different. You go over to Acts chapter 14. There's a statement that the Apostle Paul made there that we need to keep in mind. Proverbs chapter 4, not Proverbs, been in Proverbs all night. Acts chapter 14. Acts chapter 14, verse 16. Paul said, in generations gone by, He permitted all the nations to go their own ways. I think there is a literal kind of truth there that God allowed a lot of things prior to the time of the Messiah. But now He demands that all people should repent. Now He demands a higher ethic of everyone. So even if these two passages permitted drinking, and I don't think they do, even if they did, it still doesn't necessarily speak to us today as Christians. You put these passages in their context, and what you need to be aware of is the perpetual warnings in the Bible and the many, many examples of people who drank and got in trouble because of it. Remember the story of Noah? What happened after God saved Noah by means of the ark, and not long after he was saved, you remember what happened to him? He got drunk and he was disgraced. He and his son were disgraced by their conduct while he was drunk. Genesis chapter 19, you remember how Lot's daughters were able to get their father to sleep with them? They got him drunk. They committed incest with their own father. Nadab and Abihu, Leviticus chapter 10. As we just read, apparently there was the use of alcohol somehow involved in their sin before God. God looked at it very dimly. Remember the story of King Ahasuerus and his queen in the story of Esther? How was it that she was disgraced? It was while the king's heart was merry with wine. That should resonate particularly with that first passage we looked at, the passage written to Lemuel by his mother. Wine, she says, and drink will get you into trouble. And what that does, it just reminds us of the many, many, many warnings in the Bible against the use of alcohol. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 11, he said, I wrote you not to associate with any so-called brother if he is an immoral person, or covetous, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or a swindler, not even to eat with such a one. And later in chapter 6, verse 9, do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor homosexuals, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. Those things the Bible treats as sin. Later in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, he tells his readers, flee immorality. Every other sin that a man commits is outside the body, but the immoral man sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? Your body does not belong to you. Regardless of what the courts say, regardless of what Planned Parenthood says, your body is not your own. Your body belongs to God and must be used for godly purposes. And of all the things I could say about drinking, to me that is one of the strongest arguments against it. You're desecrating the body that God gave you. You have been bought with a price, therefore, glorify God in your body. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Now, this is an interesting passage because I don't think this is intended to be an explicit warning against drinking. It is intended to be an encouragement to live in a sober way. The word sober in the Bible simply means free from intoxicants. Freedom from anything that would cloud your judgments and make you do stupid things. And he says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, in verse 7, verse 6, he says, let us not then sleep as others do, but let us be alert and be sober. For those who sleep do their sleeping at night, and those who get drunk at night. But since we are of the day, let us be sober. Twice in that passage, he says we need to be sober-minded. He's talking about the way they think, talking about the way they look at things, talking about how they conduct themselves in every situation. And then again, we also have these passages from elsewhere in the Bible. Go back to the book of Proverbs one more time. I want to just reread some of the texts we've already looked at. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 1. Wine is a mocker, strong drink a brawler, and whoever is intoxicated by it is not wise. Look at Proverbs chapter 23. Proverbs chapter 23, verse 19. Listen, my son, and be wise, and direct your heart in the way. Do not be with heavy drinkers of wine or with gluttonous eaters of meat, for the heavy drinker and the glutton will come to poverty, and drowsiness will clothe one with rags. And then that final text that we have there in Proverbs 23, verse 29, who has woe? Who has contentions? Who has complaining? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? Those who linger long over wine, and those who go to taste mixed wine. Do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. Hit the pause button right there. Doesn't that sound like a Budweiser commercial? I like to watch sports on TV. Who are the big advertisers in sporting events? Beer. 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 Is there any surprise there? How is beer portrayed in movies? How is it portrayed in advertising? It's great. It's wonderful. These people are guzzling this stuff and they're having a great old time. Oh, and do it responsibly. Have a designated driver. Why would you have a designated driver if this is such an innocent thing? Because it's dangerous. That's why. And you'll get hurt. Years ago, it was around Super Bowl time, and I got a religious paper in the mail, and the author just made this sarcastic remark. He said, have you ever seen anything more stupid than a beer commercial? I think beer commercials are some of the most intelligent advertising on the market. They know what they're doing. They know what buttons to push. They know how to get your attention. And we need to be sober. We need to be vigilant. We need to be watchful. They try to hook you in with very simple, straightforward appeals. This, they say, is the good life. And our culture is so drugged up and drunk up, we can't see straight. Even if the Bible made allowances, I can make a pretty good case that Christians ought to run screaming away from anything close to this. Our culture puts so much emphasis on feeling good about themselves. You look at athletes who ruin their lives by use of steroids. You look at people who ruin their lives by use of drugs and alcohol. You see it in the papers every day, and then we say, oh, but there's nothing wrong with that. We are fools if we think otherwise. Look at the world around you and look how people have ruined their lives doing the very things that good old Mama Lemuel warned against. Not only is it unworthy of kings, it is unworthy of the king's children. We are sons of the king of this universe. And we need to take that seriously. We need to avoid those things that would ruin our lives and ruin the lives of others. So do these passages, and there are others that we could look at, do they really give us permission to go out and live the good life, as the ads call it? And my answer is absolutely not. And you're nuts if you think you can find happiness in a bottle. It's just not there. We need to sober up. The Lord is returning someday. It's interesting that many of the passages in the Bible that talk about being sober are connected with the second coming of Christ. His message is not, don't get drunk before the Lord comes back. His message is, get sober, get real, because the Lord is coming back. And we need to take it seriously. Are you ready for the Lord's return? Are you living soberly and righteously and godly in this present age? If not, you need to make some corrections. If we can help you in any way, we invite you to come.